has endowed and established our technology law and policy clinic. So we call her an honorary alum. Pam Samuelson is the definition of a pioneer in technology law, has really led many of the important pathfinding developments, thinking through where the puck is going, to use the Wayne Gretzky phrase. Jim Packer is the president of Lionsgate, which has now also acquired Starz Encore, making you a Colorado company.
Exactly. How about that?
Welcome home.
Thank you.
Matt Bond at Comcast, NBCUniversal. He graduated from this law school a little while ago, has also set up a scholarship at this law school, and is also going on hiring your 7th summer intern in a row or something to that effect. So we're very appreciative. Content issues are really fascinating with data, and it was teed up really nicely. I think Chris Sprigman may have said this, and so did Jeff, which is Netflix a movie studio or a data company? And Jeff Blattner, I believe, said the rationale, the raison d'etre for the AT&T Time Warner merger was we need to monetize the data on customers in a way that can compete with Netflix. So obviously data issues intersecting with content are important. Let me start by talking about that, and I'll give Matt sort of the first whack at this. Some are concerned about the world that we live in, the world of data analytics, because there's a sense that maybe it's replacing human judgment. And of course, one classic story is Seinfeld was able to grow and build an audience because people believed in it. But if you were strictly doing things based on data, you might be too quick to pull the plug. Is there a risk that the quants are taking over in any way that is going to remove creative judgment? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Both? How do you analyze the changing nature of creativity in a world of data analytics?
I actually don't think data is changing the world we live in, but in terms of the production of content and movies, it hasn't had that profound an effect. Now, certainly there's a lot of data that's collected about how this director is done box office-wise, how this actor's done box office-wise, how does this actor do overseas in China, and so there's a lot of analytics around that. But the fundamental thing about the creative process is, you know, every idea starts out as a wonderful movie, and then from there, it's got to get a writer, it's got to get a director, it's got to be cast, it needs to be promoted, it needs to be released, so it can come off the rails or get on the rails through any part of that process. And you think of a movie like Ted, which was a huge success, but if you tried to pitch that movie, you'd say, well, it's about a talking teddy bear. No one would make that movie, and you can't even really analyze it quantitatively whether that's going to be successful. And so often in the creative process, it's really much more of a judgment call than it is data analytics, at least in what I've seen. Though there is still, you know, plenty of data gathering that goes around it, but you know, fundamentally, it's really about who you think is going to bring a good product to the table. And then oftentimes also in the TV production business, it's around big names. You know, are you Frank Darabont, who did Walking Dead? Are you Vince Gilligan? You know, are you Steven Spielberg? And nobody, when Steven Spielberg walks in and says, I want to do a movie, no one's saying, well, let's figure out if that movie's going to be any good. You know, they basically said, yeah, great, Steven, let's do whatever you want to do, and we'll see how it goes. So.
Would you say the same about TV shows? Is that your analysis the same, or is there more data analytics on TV than on movies?
I would say it's about the same. There's probably more analytics in terms of sort of genre and stuff like that, and you have a lot of similar TV shows. How did they perform? But once again, I think it becomes so intuitive, and to use my example, Vince Gilligan, who did Breaking Bad, when he walks in the door, he comes in with credibility. And as I said, you know, before, you can take really almost any idea, and that can be a huge success, or it can be a huge failure. You know, there's some alternative universe where the Lone Ranger was a huge hit, you know, or the Mummy.
So Jim, when you think of data, when I think of data analytics, I think of the scene in Moneyball where the scouts are all talking to Billy Beane and they say, this guy is a can't-miss ball player. He totally looks the part. And this person can't be successful because he has an ugly girlfriend. And Billy Beane says, what's their on-base percentage? how much has that world of data analytics, in your experience, filtered into the process, or how much is it still old school, the same way you might have done it 25 years ago?
It's filtering in every single day. I agree with Matt. You have to have a good idea. I think if John Feldheimer, our CEO, was using data when they brought in a book about kids killing kids and then ultimately became Hunger Games, he probably wouldn't have done it. Because that was probably a movie that when people think back, that's not a good title and not a good situation. It was one of the reasons why it got shopped around Hollywood. Nobody picked up Hunger Games until we did. And it was a gut call. It was a gut call that there was a story there and a connection and Katniss, and it ended up being the right thing. But I think what I learned from Hunger Games is because I think where we're learning how data is going to affect movies is really when we market them post-theatrical. So we take all of our marketing materials now and we tag them with pixels. And they basically go out and all these hundreds of pieces of content go out and we learn what's resonating, what's not resonating. We're learning about which storylines might be good. And one of the things that we're doing right now is when we get those pixels back, we basically, in almost real time, can find out what ad campaign is working and why. And
so how you're marketing movies, you're using a lot of data analytics to build an audience.
Yes, and I think long term it'll inform movie making, because if we find 3 or 4 lanes that we think are really working for a particular piece of content, and the marketing starts to hit, and our box office goes up, or our DVD sales or our EST sales go up, we know that that was a particular segment of the content that worked. And when we're developing other kinds of content, or even a sequel, I think we did it with John Wick, where people loved the dog. And I mean, it was like when we got all of our data back, it was about the dog. And so at the end of the day, you will see a dog in John Wick 3, and it plays a prominent part. So, I think that's the kind of thing that we're looking at now is what can we learn from all of this, and how can we deploy it without hurting the creative process. You don't want to hurt the creative process. I think you want to enhance it, and I think we're going to use that as much as we can.
I'm reminded of all those great Disney animated movies like Snow White. They're all based on fairy tales that, if you actually read them, are absolutely horrific. Brutal murders and horrible things. But, Walt Disney said, well, we're going to take it and we're going to turn it into this, beautiful kids movie.
So Pam, I asked you to be sort of the humanist on the panel. As you think about data analytics and what they're doing to the creative process, is that a cause for celebration, hope, concern, consternation? How do you process all this?
So I'm really excited about competition that's happening that we wouldn't have expected. The idea that Netflix becomes a producer of 82 movies and is investing billions of dollars in movies, and some of those movies are things that people actually want to see, and they're winning occasional awards. And that competition, I think, is very healthy, because some of the movies I've seen, some of the Amazon movies and some Netflix movies, and they're just different. So I think that data analytics is driving more of the movies made by the tech companies than they are the sort of traditional makers of motion pictures. And so I like to see the flourishing of it. I think that, at least as Chris Brigman's new article about the second digital disruption suggests, is that at least now that there's a great opportunity for companies like Amazon and Netflix to know consumer preferences very, very closely and to have large amounts of data about that, which helps them make decisions about what kinds of things to invest in that are just more risky when done by firms that are not using the data analytics for kind of thinking about what kinds of things to do. And also, Chris's paper talks about the ways in which gathering all this information helps Netflix and Amazon categorize the films that people are watching and learn things about patterns and clusters of different kinds of audiences, and that then helps them organize what kinds of things to recommend. So you increase consumption by having these recommender systems rather than just relying on the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or local papers to review a movie and hopefully get some word of mouth going. So I think that there are some ways in which data analytics being used by firms like by Netflix and Amazon are actually changing, at least to some extent, and kind of decreasing the barriers, right? So when it's like Nielsen ratings or the movie box office, that's kind of after the investments have already been made. So if you can move the data about consumer preferences back somewhat earlier in the process, you make the investments less risky, and that actually is something that helps your bottom line. At least that's a story that Chris tells, and I found myself quite persuaded by it.
It is a hopeful story and potentially to both Jim and Matt a scary story. So Jim, are you thinking that Amazon and Netflix has a unique advantage by operating in effect in a closed universe where they can literally learn very precisely about what their customers want, recommend things to them, make based on them? Is that a potentially powerful business model that gives them a leg up in the marketplace?
Well, it's powerful. I mean, I think I get a little nervous about too much curation with algorithms. That is one thing that I get very nervous about. I use an example of my daughter, who's a big dancer, and she would never get served up West Side Story in any of the ecosystems she goes. But yet, when I got her to watch it, she was amazed. And so I think there's, one thing we got to be careful of is that we don't we don't rely so much on the algorithms of what you're going to get recommended. We don't lose that human touch. That's I think that's very important. I think where Netflix and Amazon.
Another point on this, the concern that some have had about Facebook with respect to news could happen with respect to arts and entertainment, that people would end up being self-selected into certain paths and wouldn't get broader exposure.
And I get served up things all the time, and they've served them up 6-7 times to me, and I don't want to watch them. So every time they service it up as, hey, you like this, you should watch this. No, I don't want to. You're wasting your bandwidth by showing that to me. And so I think that is, I think we're in the first inning there. That's really early. I think some of it is good. I like it on some of the services. YouTube, I do get things surfaced up that I like. I think where Netflix, I'll use Netflix as an example, where it's a little bit different on the movie making side. They're making 80, we make 20, but the rigors that we have to go into and the data and the numbers and the actual making of money on those films, the rigor that goes into our selection process and our greenlight process is much different than Netflix. We get judged at that first weekend in opening box office, and everybody here can see if we have a failure or a success. You don't get that visibility with Netflix. They can release a movie. They released a Will Smith movie, and it was a Will Smith movie, but maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. Maybe nobody liked it. Maybe it didn't resonate at all. They don't have the same benchmarks that they need to hit, which I think makes it a little easier to make mistakes because they're spending a lot of money, and if something doesn't work, the risk for them is less than it is for Universal or it is for Lionsgate. So I still like the rigors that we put to our business, and even though Netflix, does have the ability to make 80, doesn't mean they're going to be good.
Yeah, it's funny. What you said is right. When I look at what's recommended to me by Netflix, I can tell that it's being groomed because of how it perceives my interests. And a lot of the shows, when I look at it, I say, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. Then I watch it, and it's bad. Yeah. So it's actually unsatisfying. And once again, you come down to a quality point. And also, I think Netflix tends to jam you into a kind of a profile and not think that you'd like to watch West Side Story or some other show. Though the data, it's interesting how each of these companies, Google, Netflix, Amazon, they're basically walled gardens of their data, and they won't share with each other, and they all have their own unique sales pitches or unique values. Facebook has a certain sales pitch. Netflix is in the subscription business. They're not in the weekend box office business. They have a different mentality. Amazon's got its own purposes. For traditional TV, we have huge reach and frequency, so that's kind of our thing. So every one of them, they have a different story and different access to data.
Let me take another take at what Pam said and see if you guys react differently. It was observed that Netflix was able to figure out there's a huge market for documentaries that, call it a long tail or whatever you want to call it, that many of the major makers of documentaries wouldn't have necessarily known. And so I don't know what % of those 80 movies are documentaries or more niche, but to what extent has Netflix, and maybe Amazon as well, be able to support more niche filmmaking because they just have the data and reach to realize that even though the markets might be small, it's significant? Has that been a healthy development that Netflix has supported?
Well, I think it's their development. They have 50, 60 million subscribers. So that niche may not be that small, if you think about it. So they have so many subscribers now that they have a lot of people, a lot of subscribers they have to serve. So I think it's just smart business on their behalf to have lots and lots of different content that hits all those niches. I think it's good for the ecosystem that they can fund it. It's harder for a company like ours to fund 10 documentaries that are going to hit a niche audience because, again, it goes back to the rigors of what we have to actually judge ourselves on a green light. But for consumers, especially consumers in those niches, I think it's great. And there's a lot of choice there that probably wouldn't exist if there wasn't a walled garden of 50 million people spending that kind of money on a subscription basis. So I think it's good for consumers.
Pam?
So I think the algorithms are going to get better, it does seem to me that one of the things that Berkeley just did is founded a brand new division of data sciences on the Berkeley campus, and it cuts across lots of different disciplines. The data science major just got approved, and the hottest thing to be at Berkeley and many other places is actually a data scientist. So with the growth of the field of data science and the growing sophistication of a lot of the data scientists and a lot of the work that's being done even in the kind of artificial intelligence area at places like Amazon and Netflix are people who actually consult from academic departments because they're really interested and you got lots of data. And what does it take to make better algorithms and better search capabilities? Is more data. So the draw of more data then suggests that that even if there's some misses now, that things might change. And so I think we're still in a very dynamic period. But I back to the point of documentaries used to be really rare, and they're not rare now. And there are, I think, a number of contributing factors to that growth in that industry. But the fact that Netflix might be willing to actually fund some of them because they have audiences, right? I'm interested in scuba diving, right? So there could be a whole a genre of scuba diving movies that that you wouldn't want to put in the opening box office necessarily, but it would still be something that there are a lot of scuba divers out there and a lot of people who are interested in scuba diving, even if they don't do it. So I think that things like that really do add to the kind of the cultural mix. So I still go to box office movies, and I'm a big fan of things like The Shape of Water, which was my favorite of the really creative movies that came out in the last year or so. But I do think that the plethora of choices now is just great.
So a logical extension of what Pam said, I'm curious to hear both Jim and Matt. You could have a computer make a movie based on what it believes people want. Will we see an AI-produced movie within our lifetime?
You may have already seen one. Go to YouTube. I'm sure there's 50 on YouTube. Yeah, of course you will. Yeah. I mean, you're seeing 9 million other things, so I can't imagine we don't see that, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's.
Will it take?
I don't think I'll go to the box office to watch.
Will they ever take over?
So no, absolutely not. I'm with you on that. So I think I actually there was a program about AI and creativity that Google hosted, but it was basically people who are
part of the kind of technical teams for motion pictures who were the audience. And so someone from IBM actually showed a little bit of a fictional movie that Watson had made. Now, it was cute, right? But even if algorithms get better, what are they going to be based on right now? In order to be able to make a movie of that sort, you basically have to have lots of training data. And lots of training data is going to give you stuff that basically is within a certain genre, set of genres. You're not going to see the kind of breakout creativity that you see in something like The Shape of Water.
You know, I think it's interesting, although the distribution business has undergone wholesale change, you have new competitors and the internet's really changed it. The actual process of producing a movie or producing a TV show is basically the same. You've got somebody who pitches an idea, you've got to hire writers, you've got to hire a director, you've got to cast the thing. And so it's very similar to what was happening, you know, in 1970. Now, it does seem that eventually AI will, you know, maybe they'll do the whole movie. You know, even the people's faces are, you know, digitally rendered. That seems like it's probably coming at some point. Though, you know, it's probably going to be difficult. Can a computer write a joke? And they probably have. Actually, I'm saying that, and that's probably already
Well,
happened.
I just saw the new, there's a Chinese anchor. They did their first AI anchor in China.
Yeah.
And I watched some of it. I don't know if any of you saw that. And, I mean, it did open my eyes. I mean, you know, you have a tough time figuring out what that situation is. So again, I do think there's stuff like that coming.
I think that's coming in 5 years. You know, that kind of, because it's very easy
I think longer
to do.
than that. We just had a workshop on artificial intelligence and intellectual property at Berkeley, and two of the leading computer scientists in this field basically said we're 25, 50 years off really having the kind of thing that we think of as intelligence. So AI right now is really good at picking up patterns, right? They're really good at sort of using statistics to really kind of understand what kind of patterns there are. And then they can actually analyze things with those patterns that yield results that humans who aren't good at that particular thing wouldn't be able to see. But the idea that they're going to be creative enough to make movies that would be opening in the box office, I think that's so far off that it's just, at this point, still fantasy.
I think what he was saying is, and I do think this will happen soon, is someone's going to write the news report. And
Well, the news, I think, is exactly right.
it's not going to be a human being.
Yeah.
It's going to be an avatar.
So the area that data has had a huge impact is, and is still emerging, is advertising. Obviously, the internet is an extreme version. To what extent on TV shows are you seeing personalized advertising start to happen, and are we going to see it? And what, if any, concerns or perspectives people have? Is that coming, Matt? Personalized advertising?
I think it is. You know, that's really the holy grail of advertising. Google and Facebook and all the internet companies essentially do targeted advertising, and they use their data sets to do that. Right now, the TV business, to a very large extent, is really just more of a broadcast model and has the advantage of huge scale, but it has a disadvantage of no targeting. On some of the platforms like video on demand and on our digital properties, we're able to do targeting. But I do think ultimately that targeting is going to come to traditional, you know, kind of linear TV, really just because the digital and VOD is going to become an ever larger piece of the pie, a piece of the viewing pie. So over time, as linear becomes less important and these other processes become more important, I think we're going to see more targeting. And I also think there's going to be...
Will you be able to do less advertising and make the same money?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. There's huge pressure, I think consumer pressure, to reduce the advertising load. Well, no one wants to walk backwards on the cash. So the only way that's going to work is you sell 1/3 of the advertising for 3 times as much. And really targeting will be able to deliver that. You know, there's a lot of technical roadblocks to getting there, but...
This is the old saw on advertising, which is, I know that only 20% of what I'm doing works, I just don't know which 20%.
Yeah.
And a lot of that still exists. I mean, although I will say Facebook, especially Instagram, I think is really starting to get, the way that I get targeted now, it scares me because I like the ads and I don't really want to be advertised to. And they do a very good job, and there's a reason that if you look at their top line on the ad revenue, it just continues to go up and up and up. It's because they're better and better at targeting. And we do a lot of advertising on Facebook. And even though we still don't know we don't know what's effective yet, we know more than we did 5 years ago. And we can start to kind of figure that out a bit. Attribution still is the biggest issue that we have.
So to give Pam a question that previews, we'll have an Oxford-style debate in our February conference. Paul Ohm is going to argue the position we should ban all targeted behavioral advertising. Paul, I believe, mostly believes that. Pam, do you think that is indeed right as a matter of principle, and will we ever see efforts to restrict how much targeted advertising we can do?
So I think you're not the only one who likes targeted ads. So I think the question is, does this hurt or does this harm consumers? I think that there are certain kinds of processing of personal data that are just plain harmful. But when it comes to trying to give people access to information about things that they might be interested in, I just don't see the harm right now. Now, maybe that's because there are things going on behind the scenes that I don't know about, and if I knew about them, then I would be more upset. But I think part of the reason why people have been so willing to use a lot of these services is that they think that they're getting some value.
I'll ask Blake to tag Paul on Twitter and see if we get his question on this, and Blake can jump in a little bit. Let me get to the final point I wanted to ask, and then I really want to have a discussion because we've got so many thoughtful people here. The old school world of 40 years ago, Nielsen was the trusted source of where audiences were and who was watching. What's happening today with respect to how we actually evaluate who's watching what and what it's worth? Because the old Nielsen model seems pretty quaint and irrelevant. What's replacing that?
I would use the word aggravating.
Aggravating in your case.
Nielsen grew up in a world where there was no way to track behavior. Obviously, you had broadcast TV, and there was no way to tell what people were watching. And so they grew up in that world, and they really fundamentally haven't changed a ton, and they have kind of a monopoly on that business. For right now, in terms of linear TV, Nielsen is still kind of the coin of the realm, so to speak. But that is very much changing. As a practical matter, if you're in a cable television home, everything you do, every click you make of the remote, that data is all collected. So the data, your viewership data, is actually out there, and there are ways to associate that with demographic information and whatnot. For right now, advertisers really aren't buying that way on linear, but it's very much happening on video on demand and on digital properties. And I think as consumption moves towards that, you're going to see more of that. And we have a lot of programs internally where we take Nielsen and then we add on to it viewership that comes from other avenues, video on demand and whatnot, into a holistic view of viewership of a particular piece of content. So there's a lot of innovation going on around that. So I think Nielsen is kind of shrinking in relevance, but they're still quite relevant.
What about you, Jim? What's your take on that?
I agree with Matt. I think there's going to be 10, 15, however numerous amounts of data sources that are going to come in are going to be manipulated to get a better picture. I just believe that's going to happen. Nielsen, as an example, one of the holy grails for us is to get Netflix data. It's been very difficult to get Netflix data. They don't share. They used to share, but they don't now. And Nielsen gets us a piece of that, and so we've started to aggregate. They get us the piece that's on our particular shows within a home, and it's done by sound recognition. So we know how that show does in a home, but we don't know on mobile. We don't know on any kind of remote viewing. So we have to kind of piece it together, and that's still the best way for us to go. But we get some data, and it does work to the point where we can at least make judgments on how our shows are doing or how our films are doing. But we're going to just need to continue to aggregate other sources to be able to supplement.
Well, Netflix actually can do it by tracking what's on what device. So that's a real advantage that
They don't like to share that,
they have. Well,
Yeah, they're not good
well, there's
sharers.
probably some data they'd like that you have that you're not sharing too.
They don't need any information.
Speaking of data, the set-top boxes of Comcast now integrate with Netflix. And when I search for a show on my set-top box, it'll search both Comcast and Netflix. If I choose Netflix, can you follow me through to know when I'm watching on Netflix?
Yeah, through the set-top box, yeah.
Why don't you ask them why you put Netflix on there? That's
Why Comcast put Netflix?
yeah.
Look, I think it's evidence the changing fates of television, and people like Netflix. And so I think Comcast has a viewpoint that they want, and I think other distributors are going to be the same, that they actually want to, serve customers, and people want Netflix, and so they're going to do that. They're going to do probably as much of that as they can.
And then they stay in the Comcast ecosystem, which I think is smart. Rather than having to come out, go to another ecosystem, I just think it's smart.
Have other cable companies done that, or just Comcast so far?
I think, actually, yeah, I think there's been some. I'm trying to remember if Charter's done it, but I think it's an active area.
Because it is interesting, initially Netflix was viewed as a foe. I believe it was the Starz Encore deal with Netflix that caused many in the industry to demonize them for viewing Netflix as a friend or foe. Has that attitude toward Netflix changed over time? I mean, is it now being viewed as they're a part of the ecosystem as a partner as opposed to an enemy?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, all of us that are in the business are doing business with Netflix and do a lot of business with Netflix. So they're friend for the most part on everything. I mean, they are a competitor in kind of a big picture way. And I think you saw, there's been some big shifts in our business that, you can say were started partly due to the Netflix effect. But at the end of the day, they're competing. To your point, they're out competing, and we all have to compete. So, you can't just say, I don't like that competitor. There's a lot of other people that are out there competing, and you just have to be good at what you do.
I have to amend what I said before as I'm sitting here thinking about it. I know Comcast knows if you want to search for a show on Netflix, and certainly if you pull up that show, but I actually don't know the answer of whether Comcast knows, okay, I'll watch that show for 12 minutes.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if they know that level of detail.
So Apple hasn't come up yet, but Apple has announced some plans to invest in content development too, and I wonder what your thoughts are about Apple as kind of a new producer of video content.
We love it.
Yeah, you would be quite pleased.
Yes, we love it. We have multiple shows in development. Actually, I think one or two even producing. I can't remember exactly where we are in our schedule, but no, for a studio like ours, we are agnostic. We will go anywhere, and we'll produce for anybody. And we enjoy producing for early kind of entrants. We produced Mad Men for AMC, was one of their first shows that they did. We actually produced Orange is the New Black for Netflix when it was like one of their first new shows. So we've always leaned in as a company when it comes to kind of propping up a new platform's original content ambitions. And we think Apple is a global ambition, a big ambition. And I was just really surprised, but not really that surprised. They're going to give away that content within their Apple TV app to customers. I kind of feel like there's a big ecosystem battle going on now. Content is the currency, and it can be used a little offensive or a little defensive, but you've got this ecosystem battle, and the key is, not one show or one movie. It's how do I get people in my ecosystem, and how do I keep them? And I think that's what you're going to see content continue to be used for over the next, next few years.
Yeah, I think, well, obviously NBC has a big studio, and we love producing content, and we basically sell to everybody. Now, what Apple's doing, what Netflix is doing, it's obviously more competition for our cable networks, but, competition is obviously a good thing. So I think what is interesting about the TV business is people still love the content. They love the TV shows. They love Game of Thrones. They love, Walking Dead. So the actual product that's being produced, customers love it more than ever. And they have a lot more opportunity to watch it on a lot more devices. So that's, good for the ecosystem. What's really changing, as Jim is saying, is where are you actually consuming them? And there is a big war there, really, battle for mind share and for, creating a platform that people want to go into.
Unless Blake has Paul's answer or question. Okay. I will follow our rule and start with student questions. Gordy.
Here, is this working? There we go. I wanted to ask about the mergers that are happening in the industry and how data analysis, the way that NBCUniversal and Lionsgate are using it, is really expensive. And so we've gotten a lot of new entrants, a lot of indie filmmakers entering the market because it's more affordable. But then on the other side, we've got a lot of consolidation. How does data analysis in content creation play into this divide of low budget filmmaking and studio filmmaking? Is it increasing the divide, shrinking the divide, or is it a non-issue because there's so many other things going on?
I don't think it's creating the divide. I think it's, if anything, it's enhancing both sections' ability to make movies. I think that, you know, there's not anybody, whether they're an independent filmmaker or a studio, that is going to not take help when it comes to making movies. As Matt said, it's hard making films. Making successful movies is very difficult. And we make some good ones and we make some bad ones, and we never start out trying to make a bad one. So it ends up that way sometimes, but we try to make good movies on every single one. But I do think we will use it all the time. I think one area that is becoming really, really interesting is the testing that goes into movies when we make these films. And I don't know how much this happens in the independent filmmaking community, but the technology and the data that we get from our private test screenings that we do before a movie comes out is getting much more robust. So we're using, you know, it used to be just a Q&A. You'd show a movie, you'd get a group afterwards. You know, they wouldn't know what movie they were getting into. They would have some broad strokes about what it was. You get them in a room, and then the Q&A is what the filmmakers would use to basically enhance or change their editing. Now, it's a full data set. What part of the movie did you like? Did you like this part? You know, there's a whole data set that we get before the question and answer even happens, and we've used it to cut and change our endings. So, I mean, it makes a big difference, and you can say, okay, you know, we test it with one ending, and we'll test it with another ending, and if one tests through the roof, that helps us make our decision. So there are times when it's not just
A/B testing come to movie making.
Yeah, and we can do it quicker with the new technologies that are out there. So it's just a way for us to make movies better. So if anything, I think that data and technology are going to hopefully make more better films than bad films.
Yeah, I think the increase in the number of platforms is really the key. Going back to the question we had earlier on documentaries, it really was no secret even 20 years ago that there was a real untapped desire for viewing documentaries. The problem, though, was that the market for any particular documentary was actually quite narrow typically, even though if somebody watched it, they would love it. And so in Jim's business, there was no pipeline, theatrical pipeline, where you could really jam a documentary into. Could have been the greatest documentary ever, but it just wasn't going to do the numbers. Same with broadcast TV or cable TV. You needed something that was broader. A lot of these new platforms, though, are able to do docs, which are very inexpensive. There are thousands produced. They're very cheap and easy to buy. But somebody like Netflix can, you know, they can call it a success with a much lower threshold of usage. And then also the data, though, also helps them connect interested people with the particular doc. So I think independent films and I think documentaries, because of the existence of these new platforms, actually are really going to come into their own.
Do we have another student question? Right in back, Ty.
Thanks. Ty Beach, I'm a 2L. To go back to Phil's question, it was about the concern we have toward the way news through Facebook has cabined us into two political bubbles that don't get along very well. Should we be concerned the same way about the cabining of our content through film and television if it's being targeted using data? In other words, if ideally journalism and art push us to think differently, will this targeting continue to just reaffirm what we already believe?
It's one of the reasons I don't like algorithms. And if you think about it, there's a lot of, even look at the documentary space, there's a lot of documentaries that have a point of view on the right or the left. My guess is if you've watched a lot of right documentaries, you're not going to get served up a lot of suggestions on the left. That's my guess. So the answer is I think it is a risk. You'd want to have a balanced thing. You'd want to be able to see different points of view. But that's not how the algorithms work. So I do hope that curation, doesn't just get too much into that realm.
Pam, do you worry about that issue? Algorithms taking their own course as opposed to having a trusted intermediary or curator?
I think that the point about right and left documentaries is probably right. I think the single force that has contributed most to the political divide getting wider and wider is Fox and Fox News. And there's a group of people who really like watching that stuff and really believe in it. So I don't think there's that much that other kinds of programs really can do to narrow that gap. But we keep hoping.
Well, another way to put it is, as you go from scarcity to plenty, you get different niches, and Fox was just a great business opportunity. You look back at Murdoch, there was a business opportunity there.
Absolutely.
And it has taken its own.
And I remember actually when there were only essentially 3 broadcasts, ABC, NBC, and CBS. That was it. And I remember going to meetings, the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference, where people said, "Oh, we need a new network." Well, we got a new network, and now what are we going to do?
Questions, Kevin?
Yeah. So I'm curious what you guys think about sort of new talent discovery and data analytics. Do you think that data is making you guys more likely to give some random kid with a YouTube channel that has some good numbers a shot? Or is the quality of data that you guys have in-house so strong that you guys want to double down and iterate and improve on your internal talent?
We've talked about this point before at prior conferences. I'm curious if it's at all changed. The theory was anyone can become a movie star, put yourself on YouTube, build a following, and then get a commercial deal. Does that ever happen? Is that just a fantastical idea, or is there any there?
It has happened, and we've done a number of those movies based on their followings, and I'm not going to use a particular piece of talent, but I will say that we did, I think we did 6 or 7, and it doesn't work.
It doesn't translate.
It doesn't translate. Because what you find is, some of the ones that we thought could act can't act, and that actually is a key component to a movie. And so you get into the middle of it, and you have to do low budget. We didn't put them into big movies. We put them into lower budget movies. So the risk was lower. But we felt like, we could kind of look at some of their material. Is it acting? Could it work? Could it work in this script? And obviously the material was supposed to be, and it was tailored to what they kind of, their persona was. But at the end of the whole process, I would say you still have to be a really good actor, and that does not necessarily mean that you can act if you just have a lot of people following you. Well, you've got the dog. Yeah, we got the dog. That's right.
Matt, how about some of the reality TV that's happened, trying to produce a star on reality TV as a entry point? That has obviously affected music, but not necessarily TV series?
Not really. There must be an example, but generally reality or these reality stars exist in their own
reality, and you can't translate into the fictional realm.
I don't know. Can you think of an example?
Kardashians? Closest example?
Trump? No. Reality star.
The Apprentice. Wasn't that your network?
Yeah. Okay.
It was.
He didn't get into movies.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's right.
He took it another direction.
Yes, he did. He took it another direction. I can't think of many. I mean, they really are parallel kind of paths.
It is weird if you think about it. Is this like, a silent screen star couldn't make it in talkies, or a radio star can't, are they all like subtly different skill sets, and so they don't necessarily translate.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Ty Trejo. I'm a 1L here. I had a question about licensing and this unique relationship with Netflix as competitors. And is there, because you mentioned that Netflix doesn't share data, but Netflix relies on licensing for the content that they have. And there's a running joke that they obviously don't have everything that you want. So do the studios ever leverage that kind of licensing, those kinds of licensing deals to maybe get data, or how does licensing factor into your competitive relationship with them? I guess whatever you can mention.
Oh, that's an interesting. But Pam didn't ask you that question. But in theory, if it was important enough to you getting some of that data, like in theory, you could negotiate that with them, or they just have said it's non-negotiable. They're giving you that data.
I think that would be like trying to get data out of Google or trying to get data out of Apple. They're just not going to do it. Each of those companies are pretty much a walled garden of their data, but they're not the only source of data. There's a ton of data out there. You go to websites and you buy something on a website, there's ways to collect that data. As I said, in the cable business, Comcast knows the clicks that you make through the set-top box, which is different than the data that Netflix may be getting on its side. Netflix will more likely have a device ID that Comcast may not have, though Comcast would have the device ID if you watched it through the TV Everywhere product. So every one of these companies has their own, kind of proprietary set of data. But at least as far as I can see, I don't think any of these big companies like Netflix and Google, they very jealously guard the data that they have, and they use it for their own purposes.
Other questions? Yeah, we got some at JL.
Hi, my name is Jael. I'm a fellow at the American Indian Law Institute here in Colorado. My question is about kind of diversity of content. I understand that when it comes to networks or big content creators, it's very challenging to get culturally diverse programming, whether that is show or movie, because they can never really match the numbers that the national, more general programming can. And so I'm wondering if now that you also have a digital reach, that you're looking into the data and the reach that you have in terms of the internet in order to say now we do have meaningful reach to be able to continue supporting this type of programming. And I ask because one of the most exciting things I found about Netflix is that via Netflix I can get international programming. Like I just finished 3%, which is a show from Brazil. That is really cool. So I wonder, how are you incorporating your reach to support diverse programming?
Let me just link back to what Pam had said earlier. One of the criticisms of Hollywood is that it was mostly white, male, traditional approach and didn't have the diversity even of this country, let alone the world. Has data analytics, Netflix broken through that? Is that another upside there?
I think the way content is distributed has broken that barrier more than maybe data, because you talk about watching a show in Brazil. I mean, Netflix went global so quickly that there is just so much different content that you can now watch that you would never have gotten access to in the old traditional kind of what Matt and I grew up in. You would never have had that opportunity. Now there's Amazon, there's Netflix, and even Hulu to some extent that actually go out and buy shows from other countries and bring them in. So I think that the volume of content that people want to watch is so huge that it's getting filled by international content, which I think is good. It's also been very interesting for us. We're creating fans with some of our shows in other countries that we never would have done otherwise. We had it was kind of a silly show called Blue Mountain State, which is an American football show on Spike. Young men like it. I see a few people nodding their head. Exactly. And we put it on Netflix globally. Now, it's about American college football, okay? And then the show ended, and we did a movie, just a quick little kind of a movie extension of the franchise. and we sold it to Netflix, and then we put it on Apple, and it became #1 in like 7 international territories. Like
But this
Norway.
goes back to Netflix not giving you data. All that work on Netflix, you just didn't know.
We didn't know, and so we put it
Then
on. Put it on Apple,
and they told you. Apple told you.
No, it just went to #1.
But
The
Apple's
movie went to #1. Pardon me?
That was in the sale channel, right? So you saw the
was it iTunes?
Yeah, iTunes has a ranker,
Yeah.
and you have it per country. So we put the movie up internationally, not knowing if it would. We didn't think anybody would really buy it internationally, and sure enough, we had like 7 or 8 countries where it went to #1, and it was all because people had accessed and sampled it through Netflix. So it's kind of this, this opening of these new channels where people would get into a show that they never would have been shown.
That's a good example of why it's so frustrating that Netflix won't share the data with you.
Yeah.
Because had you known how popular it was on Netflix, you might have made that movie.
Well, they also don't want to share it because then I'm going to ask them for more money when I go in to renew it. I mean, that's one of the traditional business.
They don't want Apple to know it.
They don't want Apple to know it either. So
competitor.
there's a competitive level here, but there's also just a pure consumer level of being offered things in places that you would never get offered.
I think Jim's absolutely right. It hasn't been so much about data as just these new platforms and how they license content. So Netflix licenses most content globally. They're out there looking for content, all over the globe, whereas the traditional television business and film business is still very much territorially based. But I will say to the other part of your question, if you look at the actual cast of a lot of shows, there's still a long way to go in terms of diversity and closing that gap. But if you look at a movie like Fast and Furious, which is an enormous success for Universal and a huge success overseas, a very big part of that is the fact that it's got a very international and culturally diverse cast, and it uses international locations. That movie would not do nearly as well if it didn't have a diverse cast. And then the movie itself is not about race at all. That's the great thing about it. But it's got a very diverse cast.
So I think another thing that we haven't really mentioned is the kind of all-you-can-eat kind of a model that some of these new platforms really provide. Now, obviously, Netflix doesn't have all the movies that it would necessarily want to have, but the range of choice that you have by comparison with conventional television or what's showing at the movies in town is so extraordinary. And so that's part of what I think the benefit is that there are really a lot more consumer choices. And this all-you-can-eat approach is something that consumers are finding really attractive. So Spotify obviously does a huge amount of that kind of business. And we don't see that in some other content fields, right? So Google Books, if the Google Book settlement had been approved, that would have led to a kind of all-you-can-eat books database that would have been kind of the Spotify for books. And I was glad that didn't get approved, but I think that it is another one of the things that is different about the digital platform possibilities is having this kind of different models about sort of what kind of choices do you want people to be able to see.
Well, there was this, has the company gone bankrupt yet, that was charging you a subscription for as many movies to see in the theater as you want?
Oh yeah, Film On.
Pass or something?
Not bankrupt yet.
They're not bankrupt yet?
No.
Are you guys investing in them?
No. No. I'm not.
But to Pam's point, these models don't work without data. So it used to be that we relied on NBC to tell us what to watch on Thursday night. Mm-hmm. The students in this group, that is just like the most foreign idea ever. Which begs the question, how do they learn what to watch? And it's through all these different signals, including maybe Netflix recommendation engine or friends or social media. Where's this going to go? How are people 10, 20 years from now going to figure out what to watch? It's not going to be what you tell them.
No, I think it's going to be the channels that you're describing. It's going to be social media, or it's going to be or recommendations. I think that's going to be a really important part of it. Another piece that's going to become very important, which is interesting, Netflix doesn't do this, is ratings and ranking. I'm sure you would say that something like Rotten Tomatoes, the score on Rotten Tomatoes has a dramatic impact on the success of a movie. And I think...
Do we know their algorithm? Is that knowable?
Based on reviews.
But it's based on reviews.
But they've got to weight some different than others, or not at all? Is it everyone equal?
I think professional reviewers get ranked higher than, kind of bloggers, I would guess, I think.
But I think you'll see a lot of that. You'll be looking, you're going to have content suggested to you based on your viewing patterns and their recommendations, and then you're going to look at the ratings and see if you want to watch it. And there's also going to be kind of word of mouth. I mean, we all have the experience, friends say, hey, have you watched blank? It's really great.
I think it's also, the movie making part of this, and with Netflix doing 80 movies, part of it is the marketing that goes behind the movies. I think one of the reasons I like our model is we don't do 80, and the 20 that we do, each of those movies we spend $15 to $20 million marketing each movie carefully. And a lot of that marketing goes to people that never see the film, but they remember it. I don't know what the 80 movies are on Netflix. I don't see, unless I'm in that ecosystem, unless I happen to be searching for that movie, or it happens to be served up to me or hear it from a friend, you just don't get that same type of kind of value creation of a brand. I look at, again, I'll use John Wick. John Wick was a movie that we picked up that we put $20 million behind it, and it became a franchise. I'm not sure it becomes a franchise if that movie
is sitting on Netflix.
Sitting on Netflix. Yeah. Instead, it's now become a huge, I think the second movie went from 50 to like 120. I mean, it became something because of the marketing, because of the buzz, because of the social nature, and that service that studios like Universal and Lionsgate provide to a film, I think make those films worth more in the kind of zeitgeist and what people will remember.
House of Cards, counter model here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, they put some effort. They put some effort behind it. What's interesting?
They can't do 50 House of Cards.
Yeah.
There's not enough billboards around. You know what I mean? It's hard. That's one of the reasons Netflix, I don't know if you saw this, bought billboards in LA. Because they couldn't get enough advertising space for the sheer volume of content they have to promote. So they bought billboards on Sunset.
All right, we'll give one last question.
I'm struck that you're talking so much still about push delivery. And you could think about how silly it would be if Google only you turned it on and it said, I have a couple of interesting searches you ought to do today. Google began pretty much 100% pull, right? I tell it what I want, and then it does its best to satisfy me, and depending on how good it is, I'll do it more, and that one. But there is nothing, I'm totally unaware, even Netflix, terrible, horrible suggestions and search, they can only search for things that it has. And there is no general purpose search algorithm or system or app for me as a consumer to open up my site profile and tell it, I love Casablanca, like, what do you got? And then I could spiral in more like that or spiral out a little bit, kind of like that, but different. But this is an opportunity for someone to provide a service that is eclectic and doesn't simply serve me what they have a license for or an interest in.
So this is an important point. When Amazon recommends books to you, it's got everything. Netflix only recommends what's on Netflix. That's right. Is this a missing piece of the market?
Well, Apple tried to do what you're suggesting, and to a very limited success. The problem is Netflix is kind of a walled garden, so they're not letting Google put you into a show in Netflix, and that's why each of these platforms, kind of jealously guard, their platform. I agree with you. There'd be a lot of consumer utility to something like that. If searched across every piece of every platform you subscribe to, whether it's Hulu or Amazon or Apple or whatever you subscribe to, or YouTube even. I don't know if anybody's going to be able to pull that off.
The closest is Amazon. they do a pretty good job because they, regardless of whether they don't have the license to stream it as Prime, if you're a Prime subscriber, they also will offer it for sale or rent. So you can go on there, and they make a big point of having everything. And even though the model is different, you may have to buy it, rent it, or you'll get it through Prime, or in some of the really old stuff, you have to buy a DVD or a Blu-ray. They at least try to pride themselves on being everything for everybody.
But that is all still within Amazon.
It is
Four
within
corners.
They won't
of
take you
Amazon.
out. If they don't have a movie under license, they'll sell you the DVD before they send you to Netflix.
Yeah.
I still can't find it. The library babble now.
That's right.
Yeah.
Blake, nothing from Paul, right? All right, let's come back in February to hear about behavioral advertising. Let's thank our panel for a great discussion. Sure did.